Okay, let's look at another example. So as literate readers of English, what do we need to know to understand this cartoon? Okay, we need to know who Lassie is, or was. Okay?
You have to appreciate the New Yorker style of humor.
Okay, we need to understand the context, yeah?
We didn't that get help has multiple meanings.
Exactly, it's ambiguous, right?
And laying on a couch means you're in a psychiatrist.
Right, we also need to know that people use that expression, you need help, right? Or go get help, kind of thing. And we also need to know that in American culture, it's very common to go speak to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, whereas in other cultures it may not be, right? So literacy entails much more than language, right? It entails sociocultural context, it entails understanding ambiguity, it entails understanding conventions, and so on and so forth, right? So literacy is pretty complicated. So let's go to your, what words you jotted down for the definition of literacy. How do you define literacy? We already said reading and writing. Were there any other words that came to mind? Understand, okay.
Competence.
Sorry?
Competence.
Competence, okay. Anything else?
To be functional in different contexts also.
Okay, so contextual maybe, yeah, okay. Anything else that comes to mind? Okay, so the OED defines literacy as the quality or state of being literate, knowledge of letters, and the ability to read and write. Okay, literacy is also commonly defined as general learnedness and familiarity with literature. These definitions, however, are quite narrow in scope because literacy is understood as a collection of separate skills that are an end product of instruction rather than as an ongoing complex process. Literacy is also seen as fixed and narrowly focused on a small range of text types and contexts of use. Moreover, this traditional view suggests that literacy development is an individual phenomenon that fails to consider the dynamic nature of the messages being interpreted or produced or the sociocultural context in which literacy events take place. So let's look at a broader definition of literacy, one that can facilitate integrating language and literary cultural content and also development of advanced writing competencies. So this definition comes from Rick Kern's 2000 book, Literacy and Language Teaching, and I've emphasized in blue what I think are important aspects of this definition. So literacy entails creating and interpreting meaning based in texts, right? Written, oral, visual texts, texts defined quite broadly, okay? Literacy includes critical reflection. And then literacy also includes a number of abilities and knowledge types. So it includes cognitive abilities, it includes knowledge of language, knowledge of genre, and knowledge of culture, okay? So this is much broader than just saying literacy involves reading and writing. Literacy involves language, right? It's a much broader scope here. This broader view of literacy fills in gaps left by the more traditional definition I discussed from the dictionary. Inherent in this definition are sociocultural, linguistic, and cognitive dimensions of literacy. Rather than seeing meaning as fixed, it is dependent on sociocultural context relative to specific communities, beliefs, or practices. Moreover, because of its focus on interrelationships between words, phrases, discourse, and the world, language is conceived of broadly rather than simply as sets of vocabulary words and structures. Finally, literacy and the related acts of reading and writing involve cognitive processes such as critical thinking and analysis. As such, in addition to using language to express personal experiences and opinions, which is much more common in introductory and intermediate courses, learners make form-meaning connections to build personal readings and writings of texts. Key to this broader definition of literacy is its focus on text and the interpretation and creation of multiple text types from various perspectives. According to Kern, this focus may well offer the common ground necessary for the reconciliation of language and literature teaching. Indeed, this definition of literacy and its use as a framing concept for curriculum and instruction can contribute to increasing the intellectual viability of all foreign language courses, from introductory to advanced, and more closely link the study of language and literary cultural content and the development of foreign language reading and writing competencies. 7 principles of literacy fall out from this definition, and I'd like to present them in 2 interrelated groupings. So first, the first 3 principles of literacy are language use conventions and cultural knowledge, and these are the content that we find in foreign language texts. So language use is always contextualized, and it occurs in the foreign language classroom through encounters with texts, right? And what learners do is try to understand form meaning connections within the text that they interact with. Conventions are related to things like textual structure, genre, organizational patterns, and the language that's used to express those conventions. And cultural knowledge is related to the products, practices, and perspectives that characterize a cultural group or system. Okay? To be able to effectively interact with this content, learners should engage in 4 learning processes. So these are the other 4 principles of literacy. Interpretation involves moving beyond literal surface-level comprehension of textual meaning to a deeper understanding of the cultural perspectives, personal opinions, and points of view embedded in texts. Collaboration involves collaboration on multiple levels between writer and his or her audience, between a reader and the text he or she is interpreting, or between students and instructors participating in a classroom community. Collaboration, therefore, entails collective social engagement with textual content. Problem solving is related to language use in texts and how language forms are linked to meaning. So it's figuring out relationships between words, structures, larger units of meaning, and how those pieces of language work together to create a coherent whole in a text. And then finally, reflection and self-reflection involve learners thinking about language and its relation to the world and themselves. This can mean things like reflecting on strategies that you use as you read or write, or difficulties that you encountered in the writing process. That's also the kind of reflection I'm talking about. But could also be reflecting on how a perspective presented in a text is different from my own perspective, right? Okay. So these principles of literacy form part of the Multiliteracies approach to instruction that can be applied to the teaching of literary texts and advanced level writing. And here you have a graphic representation of the Multiliteracies framework, which includes 3 interrelated components. So in the left quadrant, that's right for you. In the right quadrant, you have available designs and texts, which is the content of instruction, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. On the left, you have the principles of literacy, the learning processes that I just talked about, and then in the lower part of the graphic, you have, pedagogical acts, or the instructional activities used to implement the approach in the classroom. Within this framework, reading and writing are seen as acts of meaning design, or the active dynamic process of creating form-meaning connections through interpretation or creation of texts. Reading and writing involve using various linguistic and schematic resources to engage in designing. Designing is the process of applying and recycling known concepts and ideas in new ways. So if you think about reading a text and then writing about it, or writing a text that's modeled on what you read, writing is an act of designing. You're applying what you learned from the text to the written text that you create. And the end product is your written text. As we saw on the previous slide, our definition of literacy reflects 7 principles or concepts inherent to multiliteracies instruction. Among these, language use conventions and cultural knowledge comprise the basic elements of instruction within the approach. So I'm now talking about the right part of the graphic. This means that when students read or write text, they tap into linguistic resources, including knowledge of writing systems, vocabulary, or syntax that help them create and interpret textual meaning. In addition to these linguistic resources, learners also access schematic resources such as knowledge of rhetorical structures and genre, as well as background knowledge and experiences. These linguistic and schematic resources form part of the available designs that readers and writers bring to a text to construct meaning, and that instructors tap into as the content of what to teach. And here you have a graphic of available designs with linguistic on one end and schematic on the other. Please keep in mind, however, that this is a continuum. That is, linguistic resources can have schematic characteristics and schematic resources can have linguistic characteristics. A perfect example is genre, right? Which is a schematic resource, but specific genres use a certain way of writing, they use certain vocabulary, they use certain grammatical structures that characterize them. So there's overlap between these different types of resources. And just linking back to the principles of literacy, language use, conventions, and cultural knowledge, we can see language use very easily on the linguistic side of the available designs. Conventions would be things like organizational patterns, but expressed through syntax and vocabulary. And then more schematic resources are cultural knowledge, like background knowledge, our experiences with the world, things like that. Okay? And looking at this, you can hopefully see how reading and writing are linked through available designs, since both involve understanding and applying these linguistic and schematic resources. So when we read, we need to understand vocabulary and syntax, but also how that fits with the specific genre and how our understanding of culture comes into play as we interpret it. And when we write, we apply those things, right? So they all work together. Okay, the remaining 4 principles of literacy that I already discussed, interpretation, collaboration, problem solving, and reflection, represent the learning processes essential to engagement with reading and writing text, and so that's on the right side. These learning processes form the how of teaching within the Multiliteracies framework. The application of the what and the how takes place through 4 types of learning activities referred to as pedagogical acts, and that's the lower part of the graphic. So there are 4 pedagogical acts. The first is called situated practice, also known as experiencing. And this is basically immersing yourself in a text to understand maybe the who, what, where, when, why, something like that. You're not consciously reflecting on how language is used or why. You're just trying to get at meaning in the text, okay? The second pedagogical act is overt instruction, also referred to as conceptualizing. This is usually where explicit focus on language takes place. So learners will understand how a particular grammatical structure works in a text to express meaning, or how specific genre conventions might work to organize a particular text. Okay? I'm going to give you examples related to writing in just a moment. The fourth pedagogical act is called critical framing, also understood as analyzing. This is when learners take a moment to step back from the text and reflect on its meaning. So they try to contextualize it within their own world perspective. They try to understand why certain things happen in the text the way that they do. And then finally, the last pedagogical act is called transform practice or applying. So this is the most obvious link to writing. It's where learners take what they've learned and apply it in new ways, in creative ways. Okay, so it's easy to think of writing as transform practice. You read a literary text and then you write a critical analysis of the text or something like that, or you summarize the text. Okay, those are examples of transform practice. So I want to give you some examples of writing activities organized according to the pedagogical acts that are all related to writing. Okay, so when we think about situated practice, which is immersion in language use, experiencing the language, things like summary sentences, free writing, or blogging are examples. So when you think about if you're writing a travel blog, for instance, you've gone abroad and your family wants to keep up on what you're doing, and at the end of every day, you say, oh, today I visited the Eiffel Tower, and then I ate, a baguette with brie, and then I had a glass of red wine on a patio of a cafe and watched the world go by. This is writing without real conscious reflection. You're just sort of experiencing the text that you're creating. You're not doing a bunch of background research. Well, unless you're like me, and when I blogged, that's what I did. But it's sort of free writing, right? Or free writing is like impromptu writing when you were in high school, and your teacher said, okay, pull out a pen and paper and write for 10 minutes on the topic of the multiliteracies approach. That's an example of situated practice, okay? Overt instruction, which is more focused on language, conventions, vocabulary. Examples would be outlining, right, for a paper that you might write. Or engaging in revising, like where your teacher has maybe highlighted some issues in your text and you're going to go back as the writer and fix those. Okay, so you're focused more on structural elements. Examples of critical framing would be reflective journaling, and the reason I've put this under critical framing as opposed to situated practice is because reflective journaling typically asks students to say, when you wrote this text, what was your biggest obstacle and why? Or how did writing this text contribute to your language development? So there's this element of stepping back and reflecting and being critical of the experience that you had. And then transform practice examples include creative writing, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, which is why it's in bold. Story continuations, where students read a literary excerpt and then they may need to finish the story. Or a genre reformulation, so students read a poem and then they have to write it in prose. Okay, those are all examples of transform practice.